Hello, and welcome back to our podcast. I am the Disturbed Southern Belle.
And I'm the gentleman.
We want to welcome you back this week with us to talk about some execution and torture methods throughout history. We're going to talk about several methods that were used, in the older times that are not used anymore, and also the current methods that are being used. Torture methods, of course, unfortunately, are also still being used in different parts of the country, and or not country per se, but world, and we're going to talk about some of those as well.
Also, a quick disclaimer at the beginning of this video. This is going to sound different, maybe better, maybe worse, because we've had some issue out of our microphone, and so we're having to do this from a phone.
So bear with us, and hopefully everything will work out well. So we're going to get started, and we're going to start with execution methods. So we're going to talk about execution methods that are actually currently being used. The first one we're going to talk about is hanging. Now, this, of course, was something that was at one time used in the United States as a form of execution, but of course hasn't been used in quite a while. The most notable places that this is still used are India, Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, Pakistan, and Iran. Now, there's a few different methods for hanging that can be used, and we're going to talk about some of those different methods. The first one we're going to talk about is something called the short drop, and this is something that they use in Iran. So basically, what they do is they put the person on some kind of raised support, like a bucket or whatever, and a stool, ladder, it doesn't matter. And then they basically just move that out from under them, like somebody kicking the bucket out from under them when they're hanging themselves, unfortunately. And basically what happens is, because the drop is so short, it doesn't cause the neck to break. So what they basically end up doing is strangling them to death. And this can typically take up to 10 to 20 minutes for it to work.
Which is because it takes so long for
Right.
a person to suffocate to death.
To be strangled, yes. They're cutting off, all the blood flow and all that. So, yeah, it's going to take a little while, and it's not a good way to go, I wouldn't say. It sounds like it would be pretty bad. 10 to 20 minutes. I don't know if they pass out. Maybe if they do, maybe it wouldn't be as bad. But if not, that would be horrible, horrible way of dying.
I would assume so, because you typically pass out from lack of oxygen
Right.
before you die.
We would hope so, because that sounds brutal. We're going to move on and talk about next is the pole method. So the pole method is something that basically it literally translates to something called the strangling gallows. This is a process that is very odd. Actually, I've never even really seen this method used, to my knowledge anyway. I may have on maybe a documentary or something from older days or whatever. But basically what happens is the condemned person is made to stand before a specialized vertical pole or pillar, and it's about 9 to 8 feet in height, and then a rope is wrapped around the condemned's feet and routed through a pulley at the base of the pole. They're then hoisted to the top of the pole by means of a sling running across their chest and under their armpits, and then a narrow diameter noose is looped around the prisoner's neck, then secured by a hook mounted at the top of the pole. The chest sling is then released, and the prisoner is rapidly jerked downward by the assistant executioners via the foot rope. The executioner stands on a platform about 3 to 4 feet high beside the condemned, and they would place the heel of their hand beneath the prisoner's jaw to increase the force of the neck vertebrae at the end of the drop, and basically manually break their neck if they needed to.
Jesus Christ.
Right, so it sounds pretty bad too. I don't even know. Imagine being an executioner. That sounds like a horrible job too.
Unless you enjoy it.
I guess. Maybe it was a good time for serial killers or whatever. Who knows? But that is the pole method. The next method we're going to talk about is the standard drop. And it involves a drop of between 4 and 6 feet, and it came to be used in roughly 1866 when there was an Irish doctor named Samuel Houghton, and he basically figured out, that it was the short method wasn't working or whatever, and it was causing a lot more pain than was necessary, and he tried to come up with a more humane improvement. So he wanted it to be far enough where when they dropped, it would actually break their neck. And a standard drop will generally do this. And that's like when they're dropping somebody 4 to 6 feet.
So, like, the Old West American hangings
Sort
at the
of,
gallows.
yeah, sort of the gallows or something like that would be very similar to that. Another one is a long drop. And this was also a measured drop that was introduced in Britain in 1872 by William Manwood as a scientific advance on the standard drop. So instead of everyone following this, basically following the same distance, they would take into consideration the person's height and weight to know how much slack to provide in the rope, blah, 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 basically to make sure that it would be enough force to cause exactly enough force to break their neck. So I guess of all of them, I guess that sounds the best.
At least it was kind of quick.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, none of them sound great, but that one does sound like it might actually do the job without you having to suffer for a while. So the next method we're going to talk about is shooting, which would be like firing squads, or also they can do a single gunshot. It's still used worldwide, and it's pretty much the most common method of execution worldwide. It's used in about 70 countries, and it's usually a firing squad. The most it was ever used in like the U.S. was basically during the Confederate War. So this, or the Civil War rather, but you know what I'm saying. Anyway, basically, during that time, there were like 433 men of the 573 men who were executed during the Civil War for different reasons, probably, trying to run away, whatever. They were killed by a firing squad. It looks like the majority of them were killed by the Confederate Army. 247 of the 308 men that were executed by the Confederate Army were killed by firing squad, and 186 of the 267 executed by the Union Army were killed by firing squad. But it is still a method that is used today. They will also sometimes, like in different parts of Asia, use a single gunshot where they sometimes will even sit them in a chair and tie their hands behind their back and kind of tie them to the chair and then stand behind them and shoot them, which sounds very brutal as well. I couldn't imagine having to be the one who did that, but that
sounds like a bit much.
It does. It really does. But that is another method that is being used today, is, of course, the firing squad or the single gunshot. Next, we're going to talk about lethal injection. So, lethal injection, of course, is also something that is used in the United States. It is one of the methods that is used for execution. And for anyone who doesn't really know what it is, it's basically a practice where you inject people with these different types of drugs. Usually one is like a paralytic and a barbiturate, and then a potassium solution. And the potassium solution is supposed to be for the purpose of causing rapid death. So the main application for this procedure, of course, is capital punishment. It is used in some other countries, but it is considered to be one of the more humane ones. Now, I'm not really sure if it is, because there have been instances in which individuals have been injected with the paralytics and then were still conscious, and they were supposed to knock them out and things like that, and basically botched executions, and they've been deemed as basically almost torture. I mean, I can imagine it would be pretty rough, because you're basically being injected with something that's supposed to do something, but something doesn't work, or you don't get injected. I don't know. It's just different things happen, but it sounds like it could be pretty bad, actually, if it doesn't take place like it's supposed to. Now, whether or not it hurts when you the other way, I don't know, but it is supposed to be one of the more humane, and I use that term loosely, methods of execution, right. Next, we're going to talk about the gas chamber. Okay, so a gas chamber normally is like a sealed room if they're using it for an execution. But it can be any room or any kind of facility, a dumpster. I mean, it could literally be anything. Anything that you can seal up to where you can pump something in and it can't get out, basically. So what they do is they put these people in these rooms, and usually there's like a tablet that drops into a solution, and then it lets out this poisonous gas. The most common ones that they use are hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide. It is still used in the United States. It's legal in Arizona, California, Oklahoma, and Wyoming as a secondary method. It was also has been used in Lithuania. Those are the only two places where it's ever been used. I mean, sometimes I've even heard of them using it for animals and things like that. I don't know about this. I don't know. This method, I've heard said, is not as bad as what people think, that you just sort of go to sleep. But I don't know how brutal it would be. I don't know. What do you think? It doesn't sound like it would be too fun.
No, it really doesn't. Definitely not one of the ways I'd want to go.
No. But yeah, that is another method that is still used today. Of course, the next method a lot of people have probably heard of that we're going to talk about is electrocution. So electrocution is normally in the form of something called the electric chair. It is still used. It's a selectable method as of 2024, even in Alabama. It was conceptualized by a dentist named Alfred P. Southwick from Buffalo, New York in 1881.
So this was actually something I've known for a while, that it was made by a dentist.
Which is what? I mean,
yeah.
A dentist? Why would a dentist be even thinking about anything like this? I have no idea.
Something kind of interesting, though. The original concept drawings for the electric chair, or at least what we think is the original concept drawings, was actually looking like a dentist chair.
I can imagine. I mean,
the way the chair was designed looked like it was a dentist chair.
Right.
Just with a electric bunch of crap.
Right. So basically what happens is, they kind of just strap you to this chair and they put this thing over your head, basically, and flip the switch and electricity comes pouring through your body. And
which, this actually reminds me of a movie called The Green Mile.
Yeah, and we all remember how horribly wrong that one execution went when he didn't wet that sponge. So, yeah, there have definitely been some bad executions. Maybe not quite as bad as what was shown on The Green Mile, because that one was horrific.
That was awful.
But there have been some definitely bad I've heard of over the years that didn't go as well as they should, and they didn't die like they should, and they'd have to do it a few times, and it was bad. But it is still a method that's used today, so it is crazy. But it is even nuttier that it was invented by a dentist, because I'm not sure why that would ever come to play. But okay, so good going dentist. Be careful when you go to the dentist, apparently, because you never know when they might strap you to the electric chair, evidently. The next method that we're going to talk about is decapitation. So decapitation, if you don't know what that is basically the separation of the head from the body. And I don't know if everyone's aware of this, but you kind of need your head attached to your body because, well, your brain does a lot of the work for your body. So
a fair bit, yes.
It's going to be, if that's in such a way where it's separated, I'm thinking that's probably not going to be a good thing. But it is still used in several countries. The main countries that it's used in, of course, are like the Saudi Arabia countries and stuff like that. United Arab, places like that. Some will use, of course, there was the guillotine. That was a big method. Of course, that's one we're going to talk about later. That was one of the former later methods, or earlier methods, rather, I should say, that was used. The good old
guillotine.
Right.
The thing that nobody can agree on how it's pronounced.
So right now, in Saudi Arabia, they still do it, but they use a sword, which sounds wonderful. I mean, I couldn't imagine anything more fun to go to than to see someone decapitated. But this is something that, I mean, has even been videos leaked online. I'm sure we've different ones we've seen that show these, and they're not pleasant, but that is another method that can be used.
Yep.
Another method we're going to talk about is stoning. Alright, stoning goes back a long time. This has been something that's been used for ever, you might say. It's pretty brutal, and it is still legal in places like Somalia, Iraq, Sudan, the United Arab Emirates, and some other countries.
I would actually wager it's probably the earliest form of execution. I wouldn't doubt it.
I mean,
seeing as how you're literally just throwing stones at people.
Right. So, I mean, you don't have to do much preparation or anything. So, but that's basically it. It would be where just a group of people get around somebody and they basically just pelt them with stones and rocks until they basically die from blunt trauma. It is very brutal, and I'm imagining it would take quite a while to do, especially depending on the type of stones they were using and the weight of them and things like that. It does not sound pleasant at all. I mean, it brings you think that, ye without sin cast the first stone. Oh my gosh. It sounds like one of the worst methods to me. I mean, it sounds brutal.
That it does. Very much so.
And it's amazing to me that they're even still using it. I mean, that's nuts. I mean, of all the different methods that are available to us now, I mean, you might could have understood it more back when they didn't really even have guns and things, but now, I mean, come on. That seems like a disgusting way. Now, I'm not going to say that no one in the world would ever deserve this type of punishment, because there are some truly, truly evil people in this world, but the majority of people, this would be a very brutal and inhumane way to die. So now we're going to talk about some of the older methods that people used to use for execution. And some of the methods are pretty bad. They're going to be even worse than some of the ones we've already talked about, which sounds nuts. But first thing we're going to talk about is the method using animals for execution.
Oh, I think I know which one you're going for.
So there's a lot of different ways this has been used through the years. There's been where they would, throw people in with lions or crocodiles, even sharks. In medieval Europe and imperial China, they used to do something called quartering, where they would basically tie someone to 4 horses and basically slap them all and make them all run in different directions and basically just rip somebody apart.
Yep.
Trampling by horses was another method that's been used. Crushing by an elephant is another method that was used. And one of the ones that sounds pretty bad was used by the Roman Empire with it was called panaculi. And basically the victim was stuffed into a sack with a number of animals and then thrown into a body of water. So you can imagine how those animals felt once they were in there and underwater. They all went nuts, and you're tied into a sack with them. So that actually sounds horrific as well. But the Roman Empire was definitely not known for being gentle. So
no. They're probably right on up there with the Greek.
They are bad. They are
Spartans.
Oh yes, they are brutal. So those are some different methods that were used by animals. The next method we're going to talk about is asphyxiation. So basically, asphyxiation or whatever is basically cutting off oxygen to the brain, more or less. So it's strangulation. It can be several different ways. Some of the ways that have been used were like carbon monoxide poisoning. They would put someone in a sealed room with burning coal, and of course it would eat up all the oxygen in the room. Strangulation, of course, we talked about that earlier with the short drop hangings and things like that. So that was another method. They used the garrote. Like in Spain and in former Spanish countries and places like that, like the Philippines. Basically, that is where they would take this like a weapon type thing and they'd wrap it around their neck with a stick and just kind of tighten it until they died, or just sometimes stand behind them and just pull it, like, and strangle them that way.
Yeah.
Another method, it was called premature burial, which, as you can imagine, if it's premature, then you're not dead, so you're being buried alive. This was used a lot in ancient Rome for like the vestal virgins who broke their vows. They would do this for them. They would bury them alive.
Tying back to my episode,
right,
huh?
So that's going to tie back into some of the mythology and different things that we've already talked about on some other episodes. But yeah, that was one that was used, and that sounds horrible too. That sounds like that would be one of the real. I mean, I couldn't imagine anything worse than being buried alive. That would be horrible. I mean, you're stuck in this little thing, little box.
Imagine being buried alive, but you can breathe.
Oh.
You have a small hole feeding you oxygen.
Oh, that's horrible. So the next method we'll talk about was a Mongolian method of execution that avoided spilling the blood on the ground, and this was back-breaking. So, the reason they didn't want to spill blood, the Mongolians believed that the spilling of blood onto the ground when killing or being killed would cause the victim to not exist in their version of an afterlife. So, they decided that they would figure out a way to do this, kill someone without spilling any blood. So the method they came up with is pretty brutal, as you can imagine, and considering it is back-breaking. So basically, they would just sort of break your body up and just kind of leave you. And there you go.
Yep, that is mean.
So yeah, that sounds wonderful as well. That is another method that, I mean, why wouldn't everybody be lining up for this one? The next one we're going to talk about is one that we probably have seen on some different movies and things like that over the years, and it's called blowing from a gun, which is basically where you're tied to the mouth of a cannon, which is then fired. Now, we're going to give you a in-depth look at this. There's a man named George Carter Stent who actually witnessed this. He was an English soldier in India and China, and he was an agent of the Chinese Imperial Maritime Customs Service and a translator of Chinese text into English. So he witnessed one of these executions, and this is what he says happened. The prisoner is generally tied to a gun with the upper part of the small back or their back resting against the muzzle, and then the gun is fired, which is a cannon. It's not actually a gun.
Well, if you think about
and
it,
then when the gun was fired, his head is seen to go straight up into the air, some 40 or 50 feet. The arms fly off right and left, high up into the air, and fall perhaps at 100 yards distance. The legs drop to the ground beneath the muzzle of the gun, and the body is literally blown away altogether.
Yeah, the description kind of makes it sound cartoony in a way.
It does a little bit, but then again, if I was witnessing this and it was really happening, it does not sound pleasant. It sounds pretty brutal. So now we're going to talk about a little something that if you've ever watched a little horror film called Midsummer, you would have seen this happen.
Oh, yeah.
And it's called The Blood Eagle. And it's a lovely thing that everyone should experience in their life, as you can imagine. So basically what happens is they cut the skin of the victim by the spine, and then they break their ribs, and then they pull their lungs out to resemble wings. And they look like bloody wings. Therefore, they are a blood eagle.
Yep.
So that sounds, that sounds disgusting. But it was depicted in that movie. So if you haven't saw the movie and you kind of want to see what it looks like, you can go for there.
Honestly, it's a good movie.
It is a good movie. I mean, it's pretty brutal now. Trigger warnings if you have, you're not used to very brutal things or whatever, or you get upset by things, but
it gets pretty messed up.
It does get very messed
quickly,
up, but
actually.
it is one where you can actually see the depiction of it. Next, we're going to talk about boiling to death, which, as you can imagine, is basically filling a large cauldron with boiling water, oil, tar, tallow, or even molten lead, and placing the person inside it. Which, yay.
Well, good way to make a statue.
Sure, why not? You got that going for you at the very least. That is absolutely right. So, I think we're going to go ahead and try to wrap up this week since we did have some issues with our audio and everything, and we're going to pick up next week and continue on talking about the execution and torture methods throughout history.
Hopefully we'll have our mic working by then.
Hopefully then, yes, and it'll make things much simpler, but if not, maybe we'll get the hang of this app as well so that we can use it to get you a new episode out Wednesday. But we didn't want to go a whole week without putting out anything whatsoever. For everyone who has been giving us their support, we absolutely appreciate it, and thank you so much for coming back each week to listen. Like I said, we're going to pick up next week, continuing on with the same topic. We definitely want you to come back. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and don't forget to stay disturbed.